Multi-hazards, all about protectees.
Welcome back, dear listeners. Emergency management is changing. Organizations like the Black Emergency Managers Association International, or BEMA International, are bringing in a rich diversity and expertise in the fields that protect communities. Today we talk to CEO Charles D. Sharp about disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, working both at the community and global levels, focusing on influencing policy, the urgency of taking action now, and so many other topics. Join us for this exciting episode. First, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Coquitlam peoples. These are the names of the excellent First Nations groups who have inhabited this land since time immemorial. This land near me, also known as Greater Vancouver here on the west coast of Canada. So today my guest is Charles D. Sharp, and as I mentioned to you before, he's the Chairman, Chief Executive Officer of the Black Emergency Managers Association International, or BEMA International. So this organization's goal is to promote African descent, homeland security, and emergency management professionals within the U.S., Caribbean, Middle East, and Africa, comprised of members within each of the critical infrastructure sectors: healthcare, fire, EMS, which is emergency medical services, energy, transportation, water and food security, education, federal, state, county, regional governments, and whole community for community engagement. BEMA International is also a member of the United Nations Global Compact, UN Water Mandate, Global Water Partnership, and the U.S. Water Partnership. Charles D. Sharp has a cumulative experience of over 50 years in disaster management since high school, while employed at the National Science Foundation, NSF, operations, contingency, and business continuity planning. He is a retired U.S. Air Force emergency manager with over 24 years of service as a planner, logistician, exercise design and developer, trainer, and serving as an emergency manager, inspector general, Air Force Air Combat Command for base level all hazards emergency management of National Guard and active duty units. This cumulative experience and the changing environment in emergency management, and with the growing impacts of climate change, has led to additional personal and professional growth as a Cornell University Climate Fellow and 2021 to 2023 tenure as the Deputy Chair, Global Health Security Agenda Consortium to meet the needs of communities globally. And now, without further ado, let's get to this awesome conversation we had. So hi, everybody. I'm very thrilled today with another Multi-Hazards podcast, and we have Charles D. Sharp. And he, I think, is coming all the way from Washington, D.C. in the USA. Hi, Charles. How are you doing?
Hello, man. How are you doing? It's a pleasure to meet you. And I want to say I'm honored to be a guest and to give a brief or for you to interview us and our perspective within BEMA International.
That's awesome. And you are actually in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes. Our office, our headquarters is in Washington, D.C., near really in the heart of the communities within Washington, D.C. You know, that was our plan when we were formed. Where would our office be in Washington, D.C.? And, you know, you have the business corridors, but we're in the community. We're actually in the community at a real professional site, you know, office location.
Okay, that's awesome, because we don't hear in the news or on TV or anywhere much about the community there. We just hear about the politics, but there is a big thriving community in Washington, D.C. It's good to hear about it. So,
And I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. So there's a link there. There's that link that we talk to all members, no matter where they are, to establish that linkage within your community and move on and get involved. That community engagement, community participation is the key, is what BEMA is about.
Right, exactly. Now, we've all been through a year, what is it? It's feeling like a year and a half almost of a global pandemic. And I'm sure that you felt the effects of it, Charles. So I'm wondering how you and those people around you have been coping throughout this pandemic.
You know, that's a very good question, Ben. And one of the things for myself and BEMA members and their stakeholders, you know, we are coping and viewing the challenges and opportunity through the lens of COVID-19 and in the midst of climate change. You know, that is going on constantly. You have two different things going on, and they're running together. One thing that we discussed was in BEMA, and I don't know if I can give you a short narrative of how we look at it. And this is what we call the bear story. And with that, we emphasize to certain members, and I tell our advisors, and we discuss, if you can't outrun the Cubs as COVID-19 and pandemics, how are you going to be able, you won't be able to outrun the bear, which is climate change, which is even bigger. You know, so that's how we give a visual aspect of what's going on with the pandemics, future pandemics, and climate change. And right now, you are experiencing effects of climate change in Vancouver with the heat. And that was going on all across the US. So we look at that bear as climate change, which is bigger. And if you can't outrun that, well, really, if you can't outrun the Cubs, you will not be able to outrun the bear.
So, Charles, I just have to admit to you that it's very refreshing to hear somebody say the words emergency management and the word climate change in the same sentence, because I got to admit, I was in an emergency management interview like a year and a half ago, and I brought up, like, I took a 4-course postgraduate certificate in climate risk management, University of Waterloo. So I mentioned about climate change. And one of the interviewers, maybe I was hearing wrong, but it looks like he started to laugh. And I was just like, yeah, I had another interview too. And they were at the end of the interview, off the record, they were saying, what's your opinion on the pipeline? So it's a lot of surprising things when you get into emergency management. But climate change, I even took some programs and in emergency management, and really not much climate change education there, whether mitigation or adaptation. So it's a real relief to hear you talk about it. So we can get back into that more, but this it's great to hear. Now, I've seen that you actually did emergency management in the military. So it wasn't like a lot of people who, you know, I don't know what they do in the military. They could be a cook, they could be in face-to-face combat, or they could do so many different things. And then when they come to North America, whether Canada or the USA, then they kind of get educated and kind of shift over to emergency management. I've seen that happen before, but you actually did the role of emergency management. And I think it says on your profile, 24 years as a planner, how do I say that? Logistician, exercise designer, developer, and trainer. Yes. So I'm just wondering about that time in the Air Force, how that has kind of shaped you into what you are today.
Well, one of the things you with the military, you just mentioned 24 years, but I would actually say I've been in this industry for over 50 years. Even when I was in high school, I worked at the National Science Foundation while in high school, and the evolution of FEMA and how it migrated from disaster response to FEMA, you know, and during that time in the 70s and 80s, it was more how to recover, how to plan, respond, and recover from a nuclear attack. That was during the Cold War. Right. So I've seen it expand, the trends that have gone on, and some of the positives and negatives of what's going on. And that military experience has added to that with my being an inspector general in the military. I was an inspector general in emergency management within the Air Force. And the Air Force is considered the prime. They're the lead in emergency management for all the other services. So the planning that we did, the logistics, everything associated with that, exercise design and evaluation, carried over to not only the Air Force, but the other branches, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard at that time was under DOD, and the Army. So I've inspected bases here in the US and internationally in emergency management for wartime skills based on the mission, and for non-wartime skills, toxic events, things along that nature, aircraft incidents and accidents.
Right. Wow, that's very powerful. Now, I know that in Canada and the US, you could almost say that emergency management in its current form is kind of like a new field. In some ways, it's an evolving field. So other countries and the United Nations call it disaster risk reduction, DRR, and it might be completely different. But I'm just wondering, first of all, like how you define emergency management in the USA, like as it is right now. And then how does this compare to DRR that's handled in other countries, if you know about that?
Of course. I'm sorry, but one of the things, emergency management is constantly evolving. There is a difference in how DRR is more associated, and you may have seen it in writing, associated with the international nations. And emergency management, like I mentioned, grew from disaster management, which is practically the same. But the key to it is the plans, the response, the recovery, the preparedness, the mitigation. And they've held it at mitigation. But now we're going into, with climate change and the pandemics, we're going into adaptation. And that's something that you may not hear a lot of individuals talk about, the adaptation part. Communities have to adapt to what's going on in the environment. So it has evolved based on crisis and disasters in the environment. Because you can say, based on who you are, an emergency is different based on your perspective. I look at an emergency as to save lives, to return back to that form of normalcy. But COVID-19 and climate change is saying we cannot go back to business as usual and that normalcy. We have to start to adapt to this changing environment. So it has changed both in North America, and I consider what you're doing in Canada as part of North America. We're one. But the disaster risk management portion is an offset from what I consider the UN and part of the Sandia framework, and the SDGs are part of that. That's all involved in that with the UN. And in the US, in emergency management, they do not understand those portions, the Sandia framework or the SDGs. Now there's diversity and inclusion, the whole community. And that concept was really whole community, and you probably have heard it, and diversity and inclusion back in the 2011. We embraced that. We embraced that like everyone else, all our counterparts within the industry. And when BEMA was formed, we had to take another look and say, wait a minute, what about the next step in diversity and inclusion? We're looking at, what about job development? What about self-employment? Those are the things. And these are some initiatives that we get into. There are a few initiatives that BEMA looks at in terms of the trends in emergency management and what goes on. Emergency managers should be local. They should bring that local knowledge and not come from outside of the community to do a job, to do the plans. Do they really know that community? And that's something that a lot of people really don't understand. Yes, they can do the job, who's doing it, but are they a member of that community? Do they have buy-in? And that's one of the things we emphasize within BEMA, local communities getting engaged to build that expertise within your community, to get that skill set. So emergency management is evolving, whether you're not just an emergency manager, you're also looking at being a finance manager, having that knowledge and capability. being knowing about risk management, insurance, things along that nature, fundraising for your community, for the nonprofits, those individuals, getting everyone involved. When they say the whole community, everyone in the community, and not just select few.
Now, I'm wondering, Charles, what motivated you in the beginning to found the Black Emergency Managers Association International, or you've been calling it BEMA?
And, it was really founded on, I would honestly say, some discrepancies, some shortfalls that were out there in the industry in those vulnerable communities. There were shortfalls. How do we address that? We have to look at it from a local, national, and international standpoint, because we're all interconnected. And we initially started addressing international, presenting ourselves internationally to be a credible organization by becoming a member of the United Nations Global Compact, Water Mandate, being partners and collaborators in those areas, being at the table internationally to say, BEMA International is not just another nonprofit in this area. No, we are international, and we look at international perspectives and who's at the table. So being a member of the United Nations Global Compact and other international entities, we are at the table, and our members and their stakeholders are at that table with us. Right. And you have a voice, and it's we all sometimes may miss things, but everyone has a voice. I may see something that others may not, but we're willing to listen and say, hey, I'm glad you brought that up. How many times have you ever been in a meeting, you said something and no one paid any attention to it, but you saw it from a different perspective? And we want the whole community and everyone to be involved at the local, national, and international level. We've done presentations in the Middle East, the Caribbean. We've done presentations to Chinese emergency managers. They've asked to speak to us to talk about diversity and inclusion in emergency management in the US. So we are not just an association of emergency managers here in the US, we're emergency managers globally. Professionals and the community can be a member. Anyone in the community, and the whole community can be a member of BEMA International to ensure that disaster, education, climate change, awareness, education, and training gets out there to the lowest level in education and training, the lowest level of getting that funding to the community at the lowest level, and not siphoned off as it comes down the line. These are the things that we look at, and we emphasize to our members to get engaged locally, nationally, and internationally.
Now, Charles, I was looking at your BEMA website, and honestly, I saw a real diversity of topics. I was surprised, actually, because you talked about so many things about like getting grants, job alerts, COVID news. There's even articles on blockchain technology. So it looks really cutting edge. So I'm wondering why this BEMA, and I guess it's a reflection of you and the others who are working with it, why is this so diverse in all the topics you cover?
Our website was designed and conceived to be not complex, no bells and whistles. You have the basic information to do one of our initiatives, the DEC, which is Disaster Emergency Climate Risk Management, to do that from just an overall view of what's on the site. It is a library, an archive. As you look at it, there's no bells and whistles, no pop-ups, but that's the basic portion of that with what you see. And when you look at the grant opportunities that discuss how you can get involved in CERT, Community Emergency Response Team training, but there are other aspects that are behind the scene to go to the next level. When you want to get involved, you can get involved in disaster emergency management. If you wanted to get into the climate change portion, you have to specifically state what you want. And we have advisors and working groups in those areas that are independent, have their own companies that work in those areas that can guide you through in getting the funding. Regrettably, there's always a cost associated with that, even with our members. working on a project. It's, that's just the way it is in the capitalist structure, but it's there. What you need is there if you look. Right. And if you don't, you can either accept it or not accept it. We emphasize beyond the ordinary, not business as usual, to take that added step, to get involved and get from K-12 to higher education level, get involved, to emphasize really everyone needs to be involved. And when you look at the whole community, you have to ask yourself, if you look at the site, even if you're homeless, how can I get involved? They can get involved. And homelessness is just a state, but I'm just going to bring that. It's just a state of being that can change because of some calamity, financial, drug abuse or something else. But they're part of the whole community that needs to be at the table. And that's why the site is so diverse in looking at these different areas. To step outside of the box. Business as usual is dead. With COVID-19, business as usual is dead. We cannot go back. We have to go forward. We have to adapt to the changing environment.
Right. I get the vibe when I'm reading your website, and I've read a couple of articles that you were mentioned in, that you're really about justice and empathy and compassion, not just the technical, the strategic aspects of emergency management. So am I right about that?
Yes, that compassion is there, and it was there in the military. It's just the mission has changed. There was a tipping point when BEMA was started, that it's about the mission, and the mission is the community now. There's a community imperative. The community overrides the financial. Well, in a sense, not overrides, but they coexist. But it's higher than the corporate imperative. The corporation would not exist if the community doesn't not exist. And there's partnerships and the collaborations with the corporations that are members of the whole community, of the community that they're in. And you look at involvement, everyone has to be involved. So that passion is there to say, hey, get involved. Emotion is out, but the passion is there, to state the facts exactly as they are. No bells and whistles. These are the facts. Here's the data. Here's the measurements that have been done. And a lot of times the data is there, but it's a matter of who's reading it, who's interpreting it. And within BEMA, we state our narrative, not others' narrative. This is our narrative for our members, our communities, and their stakeholders.
Right. I was just reading an article on your site this morning about, you talk about the diaspora, and I hadn't actually seen that word used in that way. And then on the site, it talks about your organization. It is to promote African descent, homeland security, and emergency management professionals within the U.S., Caribbean, however you say it, Middle East, and Africa. So I was just wondering about that.
And there was an article there, The Power of the Diaspora. And within our initiative, the DEC, that's the Disaster Emergency Climate Risk Management Initiative, we look at that the diaspora here in the U.S., you can obtain the education and training to address disasters and emergency. Take that information that you get here and transport that or export that back to your local community of your home nation or your home township. You can do that, but it has to be customized based on the vulnerability and threats of your home nation, the community you take it to. So you're getting that basic knowledge here to address disasters and climate change, and it can translate back to your home nation. And that's how we look at the diaspora is powerful and can make that change to get actions done. It takes time, but it can be done. The actions can be done here and transported there. And you have a lot of individuals, and I will say this, that come to the US, that immigrate here. They are part of a community, that whole community. They need to get that education and training. And we emphasize to them, take that education and training, let others know in your home nation what you're doing. That the documentation can be customized. BEMA can assist with that. Our members can assist with that in those nations. We have members in those nations that can assist, but arrangements can be made. And the power of the diaspora is getting that DEC initiative throughout the whole communities.
Right. It's actually in an article I was reading from govtech.com, and it said that you were saying emergency management, it must reflect the community's diversity. So for example, you said to look at diversity, we have to think outside the box and look at who's part of the whole community and then try to match our staff to what we see. And so that involves planning, preparedness, response, and you need a staff that can relate to your community and help them better prepare before an emergency and also after an emergency. So I was wondering about that diversity in staff and with the community.
And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Who are the members of the whole community? In terms of working, you can have volunteers and those that are compensated financially, but those professionals in there, you still have to have, it has to reflect the community, but you still have to also include the community. So you cannot include everyone as an employee, but you can bring them in at the table to get that different perspective, you know, and let's be honest, the ethnicity and what's the word I'm looking for? The ethnicity of the U.S. is changing more from the majority of white to communities of color, to individuals of color. It's gone from a square to a round ball. It's changing. And those demographics has to reflect the community. If they don't, then how are those community issues to be addressed when you have no knowledge of how those individuals react, respond, interact, communicate within that community? You have to understand your communities, not just those who pay higher taxes, but those who may be disabled, those who may have some functional needs, it just has to reflect everyone in the community to make sure there's equity across the board and everyone is represented. Because you have to look at the policies. What are the policies? BEMA is not into politics. We're into the policy and the structure. What are the policies? And those policies have to be changed at the city, at the township, city, county, state, province level in Canada. You have to look at that to make sure that everyone is included. If you do have volunteer positions, but they need to be at the table and have a voice and be heard and taken seriously. Not have a voice and ignore it. No, it's a different perspective based on their community. To have someone come in from outside of the community to work, they have no buy-in. They have no buy-in. And you can see that in terms of, I would not see it, but if you look at even in terms of survival by zip code, how were these communities addressed during the COVID-19 crisis? In the beginning, what communities were greatly affected? Why weren't they included in the plan? There's an afterthought. It's there, it's obvious. It's an afterthought. You did not take these zip codes with these communities into account. They were not at the table.
Wasn't there a documentary recently that's called Survival by Zip Code? I haven't seen it, but I heard a lot about it.
Yes. And we had members that was done based on the heat wave in Chicago years ago. And it was upgraded to look at COVID-19 in terms of survival by zip codes. Which zip codes are affected the most? What communities are these zip codes in? Who lives in those communities? Are they being served? It's not only, so it was emphasized in Chicago, but it was done to look at within every major city. We emphasize to our members, take a look at this. Take this into consideration. What zip codes are you in and how are they impacted by COVID-19 and climate change? And the pattern that you start to see in disasters, natural disasters, man-made disasters, those zip codes that aren't served, you'll constantly see those numbers. They're not being served. They're not included in the plans, the response, the recovery, the mitigation. And now as we lead toward adaptation, we have to change. Mitigation is higher in terms of, let's say, 90%, and adaptation is 10%. Those numbers have to change with adaptation, where mitigation comes down and adaptation goes up to adapt to the changing environment, especially with climate change, with the bear.
Right, exactly. Now, I told you in an email before, I was just saying, I've been in multicultural services since the early 80s, like I'm older too. So I just don't get it. I saw, like, was it 2 years ago? I saw the testing in Vancouver for firefighters. There was this library and they did the testing. And I was very surprised because Vancouver is extremely multicultural. Like people like me, European descent, especially the ones born here, we're not even like, 20% of the population, extremely diverse. But then I saw the firefighting testing. I could swear everybody looked like me. And I couldn't understand it, right? We have diverse communities, but everybody's white, young, strapping young lads. And I was just really surprised. Like I was thinking, are the Asians too smart? They get their kids to go into computer programming. Don't be a firefighter. You'll die, kid. Like, I just don't get it. But I can see that in first response, here where I live, even though the community is extremely multicultural, we have the first responders who are police, fire, ambulance as mainly white and mainly men. A few white women are getting into it, and they're trickling in like different kinds of ethnicities. And I see in emergency management, it's like across the US and Canada, it's the same. And I know that, as you were just saying, at the community level, if you have people that are just of one mindset, one culture, the results on the ground, it might look good for their own communities where they live in. But for other communities where the culture, the ethnicity, even the language could be different, it'll be totally different outcomes. And as we've seen over the last few years, the outcomes are not good. So we need to up our game, like totally up our game, right?
And when I mentioned earlier North America, and I mentioned Canada and the US included in that. And when you look at the First Nations in the US, in North America, there are no borders associated with them.
Right.
And are they included? Are they at the table? And you have to always take that into consideration. And where are those serving your community? Where are they coming from? Where do they live? You're not restricting anyone. You want to hire the individuals that can do the job, but you can build up that workforce, starting even in the K-12 level. That multi-skilled portion of what we look at the K-12 level, high school level, volunteering. You do CERT and others have do CERT, and it's volunteer work, but you're getting a vast amount of information, how to coordinate, communicate, and work together to get the job done. But are there job opportunities from that? Yes, they are. So it's about those opportunities have to be offered to them. You have to reach out to them. When I spoke to the Chinese emergency managers, it was a similar type of question. How do you engage them? You step outside of your barrier, your wall, and you engage them. You bring them in to get the trust and credibility, because trust is earned, but once it's lost, it's hard to regain. It's hard to regain. And in communities of color, is there trust? Is there trust in government? You have to take those type of questions and other questions that we ask within BEMA, those hard questions. We ask them, is there trust? Yes or no? No. Okay, let's build that trust.
Right.
How do we increase the workforce job developments within communities? Where does it start? Even when I mentioned the whole community, when you look at even from a volunteer level, are ex-offenders involved? They've done their time. Why can't they do volunteer work in CERT? You have to ask yourself that question to build that trust, to make sure everyone in the community is welcome, to help the community recover, to adapt to the changing environment.
Right. So I used to be involved in employment services here in Vancouver, and I noticed that a lot of different ethnicities, because they couldn't get into good professions, and you'd see that some of the, for example, the city councils or the parks, it's mostly white people again. And so a lot of ethnicities like the Koreans, even the people from Africa, from Middle East, they end up doing small business, right? Whatever, like all kinds of small businesses. So I know that in emergency management too, there's like in US, you have FEMA, and then here in Canada, we have like federal, provincial, and then we have municipal emergency managers. Right. But I've noticed some people, they just go out of the system and they end up creating a business, and they get contracts or they have customers they work for. And then, of course, people are working for bigger companies in business continuity. So I'm wondering, is that something that you've thought about for your members? Because sometimes it's like the door is locked in some communities, and it's like you have to go outside the box to do what you feel is important.
Yes, we have considered that. And we look at that in terms of going from employed to self-employment. That's what that relates to, being employed to self-employment. You have the knowledge, skills, abilities, and the expertise, but are they promoting it? Who's mentoring you? And when you look at the contracts, who's getting those contracts?
Right.
How are they getting those contracts? Can they do the work? Are they in the US? We have, the Small Business Administration. There's usually a certification program. Are they mentored? And usually that's set aside funds for those small businesses. But then you have the prime contractors. Who are the prime contractors? Why can't an AA be a prime? Someone who has left a position, not just within emergency management, but any career field. One of the things, we have members in emergency management that has come out during COVID-19, affects every critical infrastructure sector. There's an emergency management type of position there. But can you leave and go out on your own and be self-employed, or do you need to work for an employer? Someone has done 20 years of work, but they want to go out on their own. And we look at also that transitioning. How is that transitioning for them to do that? Can someone leave on the private sector and become a contractor? And there's no corruption, but they can do the work. They have the knowledge, skills, and expertise. And we're seeing that with a lot of individuals through COVID-19. They're not going back to work. Well, how is that income going to come? So looking at individuals leaving, that's something that we take very seriously within BEMA. It's part of even our initiatives to look at being from employment to self-employment, of getting those contracts, of mentoring others, of making sure you get that education, knowledge, and experience to get these contracts, to look at the structure, the policy. What is a policy? We want to look at that policy to say, why not? We can understand from a federal level there are restrictions, but at the local level, who is getting those contracts? Because that's building jobs. You're building jobs by keeping those contracts at the lowest level, where it's not just minimum wage, it's a living wage that's being done for the community. So BEMA, we call that the T. One of the initiatives I mentioned was the DEC. We also have another initiative, the TR, Transition, Employment, and Resources. And that resources part, transition is that transitioning from being employer to self-employed. And, it's these type of initiatives we're explaining to our members to get that to them, to say, You may want to go out on your own, but you have the knowledge, skills, and ability. How are you going to transition? The equity portion, it should be equal across the board in terms of who gets the contract. And what are the resources that are available within the community? So these are the things that we look at, because every community has resources. From a fire hydrant to an overhead light, a night light, that's a resource in the community. The transformer that feeds the community, that is a resource. Are those resources being taken care of? And are they being looked at from a disaster emergency management and a climate change perspective? From the military side, we made sure the resources were there to complete the mission. For a community, what are your resources for you to sustain yourself within the community? So it changes based on who you're talking to, but the resources are there for the federal, state, county level, and the local level. The community has resources also that they have to keep track of and know, hey, we may need to upgrade these communities, to change these resources. But the TER, transition, equity, and resources, that's the other initiative we look at. The DEC initiative, disaster, emergency, climate risk management. The TER, transition, equity, and resources.
Right. Got me really thinking here. No, actually, back in spring of 2018, I decided to totally change my career and go into this, because I'd studied climate change for years, and especially in the late 2020, what was it? Say around 2009, 2010, I spent a lot of time researching, reading up from the library, reading everything I could about climate change. And then, as with some other things in life, I just forgot about it for a few years, because I thought, what can I do? I'm just a lonely individual in my apartment with my family. And then later on, I said to myself, if I'm going to do anything in my life the next few years, it's got to be working on this problem, because what about the younger generations? They're going to deal with all this stuff. So, and I'd never actually heard about emergency management. And then I was going online, I was like, wow. But then after these 2 years of looking at emergency management, I found it is not the robust field that it should be. It is not the field that is really in tune with all of the latest research and science about, and community development issues about climate change adaptation. There's a really big gap there. So I guess my point is, number one, this field of emergency management, it should be super robust. Like in Canada, if a disaster happens, they don't use emergency management. They send in the army. If we ever get attacked from another country, not yours, but somebody else's country, or something happens, we got our army that's too busy, going into seniors' home for COVID-19 or floods or wildfires. They're not doing the defense. And so emergency management, I think in many countries, it needs to be totally not only changed, but it needs to go on a grand scale, and also include climate change adaptation as one of the number one themes. Yeah.
And not to interrupt, but like I mentioned in the beginning, I've been in this over 50 years as it evolved from civil defense, disaster management, to emergency management. And that evolution brings in more professionals, more knowledge, skills, and ability, and tools to communicate. Radios, cell phones, sat phone capabilities, to communicate with each other. And the most important feature that we have right now are cell phones. We can communicate across the board with people in other countries during a disaster, as long as your phone is charged. But that narrative that we put out, that communications aspect of what needs to go to the local community, to across the board, is that information getting communicated out? I see your program and those like you, especially what you're doing, having us here, is getting that information out, communicating the idea. And you are an important feature of what we're doing. Getting that information out, you're giving us the opportunity to say, it's different. It's not business as usual. BEMA's not going to talk that way. We're going to give you the facts, just like I would do in an evaluation as an inspector general on what the problems are. What are the actions needed to get the job done? What are the actions needed for everyone in the community to get involved? What are the actions needed to address climate change and adaptation? Because climate change, when you started to do that, it was like green and no, that's just one area. It's more than that. It's more than that. And I know you've done research on this in the past. Climate change issues were in the 90s, not just 2000s. And now it's coming to light even more.
Right. Like even you want to forget about it, and then you'll get a huge storm, and then you'll get a heat wave, and then you'll get just unbelievable wildfires. And it's like, you can't forget it. Like every 2 months, there's some big reminder.
And it's not just being reactionary. It's about, we're emphasizing with actions and what we're doing and on our website and what you mentioned and what you're doing now by having us here, letting BEMA have this platform with you, is about being proactive. Everyone needs to be proactive now to get the job done. BEMA is here to do this for those underserved communities. So vulnerable communities, get involved. Private sector, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, get involved. Everyone in the whole community needs to have this understanding. The K-12 level, high school, college education, you teach to get involved. You have to get involved so that we leave a legacy for the next generation of youth that are going to be the leaders. We have to mentor them to take over and lead and say, this is the areas you need to do, and not be deterred. It is stressful, it takes time, but it can be done.
Right, exactly. And there's a real urgency nowadays. It's there. Mm-hmm. And I can just sense it, that this is a real, in fact, historic time. So shifting to the international level, Charles, I'm wondering, there's something called, and I never really heard about it, the United Nations Global Compact.
Yes.
And you have been collaborating with the UN on that. So I'm wondering, what is that?
United Nations Global Compact, it's really nonprofit or any organization can become a partner and a member. They can apply all the instructions on the website. And if you notice, even on my signature statement and our letterhead, as BEMA entered that international arena to say we're credible, we're professional, this is who we are. We're not just about emergency management in the US, we're about disaster risk reduction, Sandia framework, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. How is BEMA aligned with that? So even your organization can become a member of the UNGC. You're at the table. That gives you the opportunity to be at that table. Members of BEMA, even though any member of BEMA really is a member of the United Nations Global Compact through BEMA being a member. And in that, it branches off into looking at certain areas. There are 10 principles, and the 10th principle, and I usually emphasize that, we bring that to the top, is anti-corruption. We look at that. BEMA, we can perform monitor, and we have done monitoring and evaluations of entities and organizations and programs. So those 10 principles, human rights, decent salary, those things along those natures, that's what we look at within that. And you also seen other international organizations we're part of. And we, even within the African organizations, the Middle East organizations, it gives you the ability to be at the table and have a voice. And that's the key. You're at the table and have a voice. And hopefully, BEMA being at that table, myself and other key advisors, we're asking the right questions. We're asking the right question. And when you look at, when I mentioned the sustainable development goals, we've even asked organizations, which goals does your organization adhere to? And I'll just give you two, number 11 and 13 that we adhere to. And number 11 and 13 is make cities and human settlements inclusive. That is goal number 11. And number 13 is take urgent action to combat climate change. So what we're doing are addressing those two goals. You are part of the SDGs and what you're doing. Now you take the SDGs and you look at all 17 of them and say, which ones is my organization addressing? Which ones are BEMA addressing as a member of BEMA? And that was just two that I mentioned. And there is a third, that we can say we're part of, so there are others, but, that's to give you an idea of that international aspect of what we're doing.
Right. And Charles, I saw there's something else I was curious. It was called African think tanks. And I saw you were involved in that. So I wonder what is that?
And that goes back to being at the table and having that voice, back to United Nations Global Compact, being at that table to bring the information about, as we mentioned earlier, diaspora, how the diaspora can be used. But the main goal is we're at the table. We're at that table, and we have a voice in African affairs. Some African affairs, not politics. We are not in the politics. We're in the policy. We can look at the financing internationally of what's going on in those countries, in the Caribbean and Africa, and other nations, other South to South nations. What's the financing? How is global health security agenda issues being addressed? Pandemics, things along that. How is emergency management being addressed in those countries? How are you adjusting and adapting to climate change? Do you understand that? Are you using the Sandia? Are you looking at the Sandia framework, disaster risk reduction? Or are you using the principles of emergency management from the US? So which one of these are you using? Let's work with that for your communities. But we look at what's the climate action planning that's going on. And that's the key. Is there any climate action planning? And we call that CAP, C-A-P, climate action planning, or even climate action resource. So there are other acronyms we can use, but what is going on? We're at the table. We can ask the questions for our members that are in those nations, in those communities.
Right. Now, something you said about not being involved in politics, but in policy. And I remember, like, as a kid growing up in the 70s and the 80s, well, maybe I was just a kid, but I remember when I was younger, a lot of people just didn't care about politics. It was just boring. We'll let somebody else handle it, right? But in the last few years, it's like, especially with social media, everybody's jumped on board and everybody has an opinion about everything, right? And I find at times I've even said something on my Twitter that I kind of regret, like, why did I even bother? But it's like it's a fine line. Like, how do you do that? How do you separate the policy and the politics in this new kind of very political atmosphere we find ourselves in?
Well, it's more the policies and decision makers, because they're two, someone can write policy, but they're not a decision maker in terms of what's getting done. And usually the decision maker is going to look at the financial aspect of it, of what's going on. That thin line between politics and policy, it is there, but we do not, and there are restrictions being a nonprofit entity within the US. You can't support just one candidate. You got to support equal, but we stay out of politics. We want to look at the policy for the communities, the policies that affect those communities in our lane of emergency management, disasters, and climate change. We want to stay in our lane, not other lanes. We can address those issues. We'll look at Black Lives Matter and other issues, but we will stay in that our lane of emergency management, of those initiatives that we have, disaster emergency management and climate change. In disasters and emergency management, we do look at water and food security. We have to look at that because what are the basic needs when a disaster occurs? Emergency management ensures those are provided. Housing, shelter, water, and food to return back to some normalcy in your life. But the normalcy, because it's not business as usual, we have to look at the adaptivity of that community now to move on. Are those policies being there for adaptation? Who's getting the funding? How is that funding distributed? How hard is it to get that funding? You know, who's making the policy? Is it only key individuals? And I would say, is it only white individuals making the policy? Yeah. Or who's at the table to give a different perspective on those policies? To say you have to be all inclusive. The equity, is the equity there? You know, initially when we started talking, you knew about DC, but you didn't know about the communities. That's what we look at. Hey, is the community we're in, are they included in the policies for DC? It's a yes or no question. And that's what we look at the local level. And with our members and their stakeholders, look at the policies, get into the policies. Look at the funding. Who are the policy and decision makers? You need to know that. We keep abreast of that.
Right. There's actually in the US from Detroit, there's Dr. I think it's Jalone White Newsom. She's a climate change adaptation specialist. And I was in a webinar with her a couple weeks ago. And then she said that old quote people say, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And the funny thing is I misheard her because I have a little bit of a hearing problem. And I thought she was saying, and I listened to it over and over again, I couldn't get it. And I thought she was saying, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the news tonight. And then we had the heat wave in Vancouver last weekend where several hundred people died. And I just thought, well, they're on the news tonight. And then we had a whole town in this province where I live, British Columbia, a whole town was basically destroyed by a wildfire. I think it was on Tuesday, so a couple days ago. And I thought, well, they're on the news tonight. And I thought, maybe my interpretation of the proverb is a little bit better than that because, nobody's going to be a cannibal and eat you off the menu. But certainly you could be on the news tonight. Right. There's the delayed effect, right? You're not at the table today. It might take like 6 months or a year or a couple of years, but you might end up on the news tonight. And who wants to be on the news for that?
And that proverb, that statement can go in so many different ways. You know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that means you're at the table looking at what's being served. How are we being served? You know, am I being served? If not, I'm just sitting at the table, not eating anything, not ordering anything. You know, so there's different ways to look at that statement, and you're associated with the news, which is understandable. But that township that was destroyed, were they involved in looking at, hey, the adaptation of possible fires associated with their community? You see the questions, BEMA is there to ask those questions. Well, why aren't you considering it?
Mm-hmm. I think there's actually, now this is really strange, but there's a heat wave, but I'd never really studied it, is that as soon as you get a heat wave, like we had the heat dome, it's still going on parts of the US and Canada right now. And like, I didn't really realize that this is like drying out your vegetation like very quickly. And then you just get a lightning bolt, or you get a barbecue or something, or even somebody practicing shooting on the mountain with a gun. And you've got sparks and you've got a wildfire. And if the wind picks up, then that wildfire can be just like spreading super quickly. And I think that this is, scientists know about this. It's in academia, it's in the research lab, but it's time for that information to get into the community level and in the emergency managers and everybody involved, the politicians, so that it doesn't happen again. because with climate change, it will happen again.
And you had mentioned, the evolution of emergency management, and science is involved in it. They have a science and technology side that looks at that, and they're emphasizing that, because every special event, there's usually someone, emergency management is activated just in case. Now you're looking at, is it a natural event or man-made event? So fireworks, things along that nature are a man-made event. You have to prepare for it. You have the team ready just in case. You have the ambulances, you have police and law enforcement there, just in case. Some communities, because of here in the US and our part of North America, this is the July 4th weekend. There will not be fireworks in certain communities because of that drought effect. The heat wave is causing plants and everything to dry, and the possibility of a wildfire or brush fire could occur. And when you look at what's the resilience factor, you're going to spend $5, maybe $100 for something, to plan for something not to occur, rather than spend $10,000 or $1 million if something happened and you never planned for it. You never took it into consideration. And that's what they look at in the resiliency dividend. What are the aspects of bringing everyone involved ahead of time at a lower cost, even from the insurance, the finance industry, investors, everybody at this table, to say, hey, we need to address this here and now from a resiliency side to address the long-term, even more costly effect if it should occur.
Right.
So that's a good question you asked, looking at wildfires and communities can be destroyed, but it's a matter of, did the community get involved and say, what if? And that what if analysis was something that everyone looks at. What if? And the science is there in emergency management, but is it being utilized?
Right. Sometimes I think it's the urgency factor, because in emergency management, it's like, well, we might get a flood 1 in 100 years. And it's just like these things that you think, well, if it happens, it happens. But and it's just like, sometimes I think the public and even in the field, it's just like things happen not every day. So it's kind of it's not like the police officers that are getting called out to things every day, but emergency managers kind of, sitting and preparing and studying for the next event. But there's sure a lot of mitigation and preparation at the community level that can be done. And for example, just before this interview, I was just reading about Washington, D.C., and something's happening there that's happening here, is the opioids crisis. And I couldn't believe that it was so bad in Washington, D.C. So you have a crisis that doesn't really have anything to do with a disaster like a wildfire or earthquake, but this is a public disaster. And that's why I called my program multi-hazards, because these things affect each other. There's always this domino effect. There's always this interaction between different crises. So anyway, sorry, I'm going off too long here, but I'm just...
No. Yeah. And you say, what's the key word you mentioned? Crisis, disaster, emergency. They're almost the same word. It's based on what's going on. It's in terms of those who are in recovery. And I use the word recovery with recovery/homeless, and not to get really into it, but emergency management can address those issues, and just leave it at that you can use that analytical problem solving and actions to address these social issues. That's all I can say on that one.
I hope this field will get more prominence and more public recognition over the next few years. I think it's very, very important. So,
well, what you're doing and bringing us here and talking about this, giving us the platform, even as you just mentioned, where I mentioned, when you look at communities and the township that was destroyed, what is the community's risk appetite? How are they involved? What's your risk? In the military, in the Air Force, we did what was called full spectrum emergency management. We looked at everything, every type of thing that would come as a crisis or disaster on a military installation. Even we've done pandemic influenza plans, disease containment plans. Those I've done while in the military that are associated now with COVID-19 and future pandemics. So those things I have done in the military. But you look at, from a military standpoint, a community standpoint, what's your risk? What's your appetite for this risk? How much of it can you accept? How much can you accept? How much can you not accept? You know, there are plans that are in Air Force bases on even the possibility of, when the space shuttle was active, of it landing on your base in an emergency situation. We had plans according to that. So it's, what's your risk appetite? And are you going to stop at the obvious? Are you going to think outside of the box? What could happen, might happen, put it on the table.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, Charles, I'm just wondering, we're just talking about risks and hazards, and now we're going to talk about dreams. But I'm just wondering that it sounds like you're somebody who's, you don't think like inside the box, you're very out of box thinker, which is really needed for protecting communities. But I'm wondering, what are your dreams for the coming years?
You know, that's a good question. And I think the basic dream that I have is regarding basically the actions that a community is going to take to get involved. In terms of individuals and families in our initiative, the DEC, Disaster Emergency Climate Risk Management, that's a dream, that there's equity across the board, that there's even the TER, where I say transition, equity, and resources, that a lot of individuals, the opportunities are there to go from being employed to self-employed. And we're seeing that with COVID-19. A lot of people aren't going back to their jobs.
Right.
They're being self-employed. They want to go out on their own so that they can have that freedom. And while they're doing it within BEMA, we're emphasizing, understand, and have the awareness, education, and training in emergency management to look at job development for our youth in the future, to look at our youth from the K-12 level, mid-high school, and even college. You need to be involved in the future. You know, I hopefully, in a sense, I didn't give away my age when I said I've been in this over 50 years. I probably did. But you look at, I have to give that knowledge and transfer it to one of the youth, to say, take this knowledge and education, look at the policies, talk to the decision makers, get involved. It's about community engagement, community participation, the community imperative. Who composes the community? The individual, the family, your neighbors, the private sector are part of the communities. And don't let one override the other. We have to start coming together more. It's a dream, but what can we make a dream, not just a dream, but a vision, a reality, by taking positive actions, by getting the knowledge, education, and skills to make those actions possible to solve problems in our communities. You know, so there are other, you know, when we talk about communities at risk, the cause for climate change action plan, you know, what's the effective strategy to adapt? Our community is going to adapt to this. You know, is it college and university? How are you getting involved in this? How were you affected during COVID-19? Did you adapt? Now you have to adapt for climate change, risk management, to look at, wait a minute, that's the bear. Can you outrun the bear? And we look at it as members of BEMA. If you're associated with BEMA, the bear may not even want you. It may not even want you. Why? It knows you have this information, that we're a team and we're addressing the issues in our community. It may get you, but You have this knowledge, education, skills, and abilities, the DEC initiative, the TER initiative, and other initiatives, and even the BEMA factor to move on forward. You're not going to taste well. It's like, oh, give them what they want, to get that financial information to the lowest level in the community, those who are doing the work, that they're sustainable.
I just want to thank you so much, Charles. It's a lot of wonderful wisdom that you're giving there, and I'm really thrilled to see what your organization is doing internationally. And thanks so much for accepting the invitation to be a guest today at the Multi-Hazards podcast. Yes.
And just to let, I don't know if you wanted me, if I can say something in closing. Sure. Like I had mentioned, any other member, any area, we have members that can address other areas within your podcast and Multi-Hazards. And it is truly an honor and pleasure that you invited us here, because you're part of getting that, of spreading the BEMA message, of getting that communications out to the average person, those who are listening, and those who may be policymakers and decision makers that listen to your program, that listen to your program, that it's not business as usual. Some may not agree with what we're saying, they may disagree totally, but we still will stay on our narrative for the community imperative, to make sure they're sustainable, that communities are ready to address disaster, emergency, and climate change issues within their communities, to look at transition, equity, and the resources within the community, to look at, we agree with diversity for all other commercial, all our counterparts. We agree with that, but we have to take it to another level. And we take it to another level with our initiatives on DEC and the TER. We don't just say diversity and inclusion. We look at equity. Is it equal? Is it equal for all? And if not, let's have them at the table. Bring them to the table. Let's make it so that they feel comfortable and that our credibility is restored with them, that trust is restored with everyone in the communities. Globally, I get it. No one trusts officials in their communities. Why? And this is something we have to bring back, because officials that we put in office work for us. And that trust has to be there. I just wanted to get that, and thank you for having us here, Ben.
That's a great way to end the show, because I think in this world, trust is kind of leaking out, and it is such an important thing just to have that trust. It's very precious too. So thanks for that, Charles, and reminding us of so many things, and sharing so many new things too. So thanks so much for being part of this podcast.
My pleasure.
Okay, take care then.
All right.
And that's it. Thanks to my amazing guest, Charles D. Sharp, for joining me here today at the Multi-Hazards podcast. This was wonderful, and I learned a lot, and I hope all of you did too. So, an important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, and other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. And second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with unless otherwise stated. So here, as I conclude this episode, I want to thank you, each one of you, my dear listeners, for being with us today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson, wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.